Hello, everyone. I'm Chris, one of the co-founders of the LSA, and I'm joined by Trevor Clark, who will be our presenter today, and Michael Smith, another co-founder of the LSA. He's here, but he's moving house, and so he doesn't have bandwidth as they haven't installed the internet yet. So he's here verbally. And welcome to our webinar on how to design loyalty programs that decrease fraud vulnerability. And as people join, just do a couple housekeeping items. If you have any questions, please type them into the questions box in the GoTo control panel. And if you have any trouble seeing us today, just log out of GoTo and log back in. And with that, I'm going to introduce Trevor in a second, but I'll just say I'm really happy that normally we're doing very technical webinars each month for the LSA. And I'm appreciative to do one more from the program design, because we can avoid a lot of the loyalty fraud programs if we nip it at the bud before the program's even designed, and as we do changes to our program. So Trevor's going to share some of those insights today. So happy to have a different type of webinar this month, and Bond are super experts in designing loyalty programs. So with that, I'd like to Trevor, over to you, and can you maybe introduce Bond as well.
Okay, thanks a lot, Chris. Well, thanks everybody for joining. Really excited to talk about this important topic of how to design loyalty programs that really decrease the risk of fraud vulnerability. I am Trevor Clark. I'm the Senior Director of Client Solutions at Bond Brand Loyalty. I've been in the loyalty industry for the past 20 years with a particular focus on coalition programs and co-branded travel and credit card programs around the globe. For anyone who's not familiar with Bond Brand Loyalty, we're a global insights-driven customer engagement company that's really focused on combining innovative AI technologies with loyalty science findings and applying some of those innovations into the programs that we work with. I think this topic of designing loyalty programs that decrease the risk of fraud vulnerability is critically important, because we've seen the damage that a fraud incident or a data breach can have, not only on the loyalty program itself, but also on the core brand that loyalty program is really supporting and trying to pull up. So I think if we can address this issue up front in the design phase, we can all save ourselves a lot of headaches and stress further down the line when the fraudsters come knocking, because I think if we've seen anything in this industry, we know that the fraudsters are going to be coming at some point in time.
Trevor, I turned on my camera. I'm going to interrupt you. Sorry, just because I'd like to go back to Bond Brand Loyalty and encourage everyone to go to your website, because you guys are real thought leaders in loyalty. So anything in terms of loyalty program design, you got reports. You're second to none in terms of just, there's not a lot of information out there on loyalty program design and best practices. There's not a lot, and you guys are probably the best source. So I encourage everyone to go to that website. I do, and I encourage everyone. So sorry to interrupt, but I thought there's just not a lot of information out there. So you guys are a great source. So I thought I would chime in with that.
No, thanks, Chris. That's great. And one thing I'll touch on a little later in the presentation is the loyalty report, which is a global study that Bond conducts every year in conjunction with Visa. So we'll talk about one of the findings and how it really relates to this topic as well. So we'll dive in. Thanks for that.
Awesome. Over to you.
Okay, so now let's take a quick look at the agenda. So here's some of the topics we're going to cover today. A brief introduction into how we approach program design at an overall level, and some of the major building blocks of any loyalty program. And then we're going to drill down into considerations as you start to design your program while protecting against fraud vulnerability right up front. So we'll look at some examples of the different ways to think about a few of those fundamental building blocks and how they interact with each other. We're also going to explore how programs evolve over time and look at ways to minimize some of the variance that we sometimes see in the customer experience as it relates to the fraud tactics and how they're applied. And then we'll also explore some of the different fraud prevention levers that can be considered as part of program design. We'll also leave some time at the end for any questions that anybody might have. Okay, so I'm excited to discuss this topic of program design and how we can reduce some of the fraud vulnerabilities because of the growing relevance. I think fraudsters have really zeroed in on loyalty programs as a target. They've moved on from some other targets and really have identified loyalty programs as an area that maybe doesn't have the same level of controls as some other things like banks or other areas like that. And also the types of the fraudulent attacks that we're starting to see are becoming more and more sophisticated. And this can take several forms, from credential stuffing bots to account takeovers. And Chris, I know you're hearing a lot from the organizations that you work with around this. Any insights you want to share?
Yeah, so, and Michael, let me introduce Michael. I did it briefly, but good morning or good afternoon to you, Michael, and feel free to chime in. As I told everyone, Michael's moving house, so he has no camera, but he is here. So good afternoon, Michael.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's just fascinating listening to all of this, and I'm really looking forward to this particular presentation. There's a couple of bits here. You've got an interesting number from Ernst & Young, or EY, as they are these days, in terms of that number for fraud, but what gets measured gets done. And we came across some interesting stats the other day, which was loyalty accounts with value in them are going for about $200 on the dark web. In reasonable numbers. This one particular one had enough miles in the account for around the world in first class, and that's being sold for $200. So it shows you that the fraudsters are in there, and they see the value, and the value that all the people who have joined this webinar are out there creating. The fraudsters are out there to try and steal it.
And
I think,
sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
I'm just going to say, when we think about that $1 billion number, I mean, what comes to mind for me is the amount of effort and transactions that customers have done to build up that amount of value into the program, right? So how many, interactions, spend transactions, however customers are earning points to get to that point, and then to have $1 billion taken out is really mind-boggling to me.
So my background here, what I would say is that you mentioned that fraudsters are changing towards loyalty programs from other areas of fraud. That's credit card fraud that they're changing from, and there's some regulations like PSD2 and that's making credit card fraud harder, so they're turning towards loyalty fraud and account takeovers. So that 1 billion number, that's probably up this year. We're seeing account takeovers up 30 to 40% this year. Well, in the travel industry, which is where I mainly focus, definitely up 30 to 40%. So, and I'm not sure that 1 billion number includes some of the things like additional costs, like replacing the points or staff or IT costs. So I think it's much bigger than that even. So looking forward to your insights today.
Yeah, and I think with the size of the prize this large, it's just with that amount of value available in loyalty programs, the fraudsters, it's really putting a bullseye on these programs, right? So there's a massive incentive for them to find new and creative ways to defraud the program. I think combined with the fact that a lot of times the rewards from this program are highly liquid, right? Like if you're redeeming them for gift cards or groceries or whatever the case may be, like once you get it, you're out. It's not necessarily a long runway to get the reward once they have access to the account. So I think this is just all backing up why it's essential to start thinking about these things right up front as we start conceptualizing and designing the program. And then, and beyond just that design phase as well, right? Like we all know this is going to evolve. The attacks and the ways that fraudsters are going to try and access the program are going to become more and more creative over time. So it's certainly not a set it and forget it type of situation. It constantly needs to be refined. And that's something that, we work with programs all the time on. So I'm going to look at now some of the program design components. So this is, when you're starting to sit down and think about what are the components of my program going to be. This isn't maybe an all-exclusive list or extensive list, but these are the major components that we would group and think about at least as we're starting to design any program. I'm not going to go through all of these, but just a couple of them that kind of jump out. The program construct, right? Like what does the registration process look like for customers to enter a program? What are the activities that a customer needs to do in order to earn and then redeem points within the program? from the loyalty platform perspective. How are these points going to be calculated? What's some of the information we're asking members to provide to us, and how are we going to be storing it securely? When we look at the branding, how are we showcasing this program? What's our go-to-market strategy here? On the Marcom side, how are we communicating with our members? What are the important touch points where we need to interact with customers? And for the contact center, what information are we arming our contact center agents with? What are they enabled to do if a customer calls in to report a fraud, to say, hey, I'm seeing a redemption on my account, this wasn't me? How enabled are those call center agents, and what do they have the ability to do? So these are all kind of considerations. They're all certainly interconnected. But what we really wanted to spend some time on today was double clicking on a few of the more relevant components for this discussion. And I think where we're going to kind of double click on today is going to be balancing the member experience on how that member kind of interacts with the brand versus the fraud and security concerns that we would see. So often these are, when we come to the setup phase and design phase of a program, these are often completely separate work streams. So the program is being conceptualized, it's starting to gear up for launch. There's two separate work streams pertaining to each of these. Each of them has a role to play in creating a successful, thriving program. But I think the theme that we wanted to kind of hit over the head here is they can't operate in isolation. It's essential that the executives that are leading these program launches are ensuring that these seemingly completely separate work streams are working together to provide an integrated experience for customers that's seamless, yet it's also protecting from the variety of fraud attacks that are possible. Okay, so now these two components are seemingly at odds with each other, right? I find it helpful to kind of look at these on a bit of a spectrum, and they kind of exist on opposite ends of that spectrum. So when we think about member experience, the major themes that come to mind are ease of use, finding ways to reduce friction for members, simplicity of the program, and accessibility. The thought is, how can we center everything we do around ways to improve the customer's experience with the program and the brand? And then on the flip side of that spectrum, towards the bottom, when we're thinking about fraud and security and what are some of the themes that are associated with that, they're often in direct conflict with building that optimal member experience. So, our fraud colleagues, and there's probably several on the line today, are thinking about the restrictions on elements of the program, finding ways to reduce and eliminate any potential vulnerabilities that might exist. And that often means creating some roadblocks for potential fraudsters. And in some cases, that's the polar opposite of what the member experience team is looking to achieve as we're going through this design phase. So when we look at these two critical components on a spectrum, the way that we try to thread that needle is to find a sweet spot between them. Now, this is not always possible. It may take some testing and learning over time to kind of find that sweet spot, but that needs to be the objective right up front in the program design phase. It's critical to try and find that balance. I think if we go too far towards the member experience end, we're not giving enough consideration to the fraud and security concerns. And while the member might have a fantastic experience the first time, it may leave the customer exposed, and a savvy fraudster is just licking their chops at the opportunity to feast on this vulnerability. On the other side, if we move too far towards the fraud and security end of the spectrum, we're neglecting the member experience. And while the program may be airtight and we're seeing fraud at a minimum, the experience is so poor that members don't want to continue interacting with our brands, where we're kind of missing the objective of having the loyalty program in the first place.
I have a question here. If I can, based on your experience as someone who designs programs, I've received some emails lately from programs of which I'm a member about why they're doing security measures. So I wonder if that could move the needle. In other words, if I understand why they're putting friction, maybe it's not going to bother me as much. So good communication might be able to move this arrow more towards security without endangering your customer, experience, or at least how the customer feels about it. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that's actually a perfect segue into the next slide. So every year Bond, I mentioned it up front, every year Bond conducts the loyalty report in conjunction with Visa, where we're interviewing thousands of members of various loyalty programs around the globe. And one of the important outcomes of the study is to find the elements of a loyalty program that are particularly important to customers. And I think this finding is really relevant to our discussion today and to your question, Chris, whereby in essence what we're finding is when, and this is a finding from the US portion of the survey, but what we found is that customers are 3.2 times more satisfied with their loyalty program if they feel that their personal information is handled safely and securely. And included within that personal information is your points and your points balance. So the fact that they're reaching out to you, Chris, and sending that email to communicate that message like, hey, here's what we're doing to keep your points secure, I think plays a couple of roles. Yes, they're implementing policies that would enhance that security, but they also want you as the member to feel secure so that your satisfaction with the program is lifted and you can interact feeling secure that your points are safe. You don't need to worry that a fraudulent redemption is going to take place.
I was just going to build a little on what Chris said. I posted on LinkedIn what Turkish Airlines have been sending out to their members. And it's some really good stuff about how to help protect your account. So that's everything from not responding to phishing scams, being careful if you're on public Wi-Fi and some other things. So it is interesting that the programs are now starting to say, okay, we can help educate our customers. Etihad Airlines also have quite a bit of information on their website. So programs are starting to do that. And I just want to pick up, I don't know if you want to just go back to your slide before, Trevor, because I think there's a really interesting bit in terms of balancing that member experience and fraud and security. Part of getting to that sweet spot is, as a program manager, having fraud and security on your radar screen is important. So in Canada, two big programs merged. So that was Shoppers Drug Mart and their rewards program, and I think it was Loblaws, and it just created open doors for the fraudsters, and they made a lot of money off the back of that, which could probably have been stopped if people designing the merging had talked with their IT colleagues. And I think part of what this is all about is having smarter doors and not necessarily more locks on the doors. And you can have zero fraud if you want it. It's just you will have no business. So it's getting that balance between, as I said, the smarter doors versus more locks.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great way of looking at it, Michael. I think how can we find that balance to, yes, you could lock it down, reduce fraud to near zero, but nobody's going to want to interact. So that's really the challenge that we're faced with. So I think let's take a look at an example. So I think there's a really simple example and see how it plays out against this spectrum that we have between member experience and fraud and security. So in this example, let's think about a digital gift card redemption option. So a pretty common component of many programs today. If we were prioritizing member experience above all else, then it might look something like this, right? The customer can order an unlimited amount of gift cards, no limits. Once they have enough points, they're going to receive those digital gift cards in near real time. We're not going to put up any additional barriers, such as asking for further authentication or asking the member to do an MFA before we release those gift cards. So from strictly a member experience perspective, this is pretty seamless, right? As the member, I get what I want, it's immediate, I'm pretty happy from that redemption interaction. However, at some point in the future, if there's some type of an account takeover or fraud event, in essence, there's nothing stopping the fraudster from basically completely draining the account of all the points that the member has worked so hard at acquiring in the first place, right? So this is why we need to find a way to create that optimal experience while also considering those fraud and security components and trying to find an opportunity to leverage both into an optimal solution. Now let's look at an example at the opposite end of the spectrum, right? An optimal fraud and security option may look something like this for gift cards. There's a threshold of 1 card per day. So even if you want to redeem 10, sorry, you can only do 1 today, and you're going to need to come back tomorrow to do a second one. And after the customer's placed that order, there could be a 3-day waiting period to evaluate the redemption request before the card is released to the member. And we're going to ask the member to go through an MFA again so that we can be really, really sure that this is exactly who they say they are. And this isn't a bad actor trying to access the account. So with this level of restrictions, and Michael, to your point of like locking things down, the security team feels pretty good about it, right? They're positive the customer is who they say they are. And if by some chance there's an account takeover or some other type of fraud attempt, the fraudster will be very limited in what they can really get away with due to the thresholds. And with that, 3-day gap, we may have the opportunity to even cancel that order before we send it out because we detected it's a fraud. So maybe in that 3-day window, if the actual customer calls in and say, hey, this wasn't me, we have the opportunity to cancel it. So obviously this is a really extreme example, but you can see how the member experience side is completely ignored here. It's completely catering to the security side, which is great at reducing fraud, but really not an optimal experience overall. So this isn't exactly leaving the member feeling warm and fuzzy after they do the redemption event, which is really what we're trying to accomplish. This is cumbersome and it's not going to leave a good taste in the member's mouth. So let's look at another example where we try to thread that needle a little bit, where we're trying to bridge the concerns of both the member experience side and the fraud side and get a little bit closer to that sweet spot whereby we have some fraud mitigation in place, but not so much that it significantly impacts the member experience in a negative way. So here, there may be some type of threshold. So for example, the member can order up to 5 gift cards per day, but not beyond that. And let me just add here, these are just samples. I'm not trying to say that 5 gift cards is the optimal amount. I think the optimal amount is going to depend on the program and what's the member behavior that you would normally see. So I think in the program design phase, we would look at similar programs and look at the behavior that we're seeing there. So what do other programs in the industry typically see? Like, are they seeing 2 gift cards at a time? Are they seeing 10? And that may inform what this threshold is set at, right? In addition to the threshold, maybe there's a 1-hour waiting period whereby in that time we could do a bit of an evaluation of the transaction. We'll take a look at the IP address to make sure it's not looking suspicious. Let's take a look at the account, make sure this hasn't been flagged for any fraudulent redemption attempts in the past. And once everything checks out, after an hour, the gift card is released. And for MFA in this example, instead of requiring every customer to go through MFA again, because if they're doing this redemption online, they've probably gone through MFA as they're first entering, the website or wherever it may be. We can configure that to only require a second MFA request if this behavior looks out of character. So does this customer normally only redeem for travel? And this is the first time they're doing a gift card redemption. Is this a brand new member where maybe we don't have enough data to feel comfortable about the member yet? So we're going to ask for an MFA. So I think the ability to treat members differently and segment between good customers versus kind of at-risk customers can really help that member experience and the overall goal of finding the sweet spot between the two of them. Again, the point here is that we're trying to demonstrate finding that balance between the member experience and protecting against fraud at the same time, as opposed to making a choice which leans heavily in one direction, but maybe it leaves something to be desired at the opposite end of the spectrum. So we're using gift cards in this example, but I think you could really apply this logic and this thinking to any of the different redemption types that you might be offering in your program. And I think it's really an analysis is required to see what are some of those factors that make the most sense for my unique program. It's not a kind of one size fits all for any loyalty program. Really depends on, you know, the velocity of interactions in your program and a number of different factors. Now next, we're going to look at a bit of the program evolution. And this, I think, speaks a little bit to Michael's example of that we saw in Canada when there was a merger of a couple of programs for the PC Optimum program. So, you know, we're using the same kind of spectrum to look at the member experience and fraud and security, but we're also layering in here the time element along the horizontal axis, so we can see how these elements fit together over time. Bond has worked with many different types of loyalty programs over the years, but I think there's a common theme that we tend to see early on as a new program is preparing to launch. There's justifiably a heavy focus on the member experience side. So this is a new program that's going to market. Obviously, we want every opportunity to make the program easier to use, to make it accessible, to remove all the friction points. So what we tend to see is that the member experience side has a much louder voice in the room. And a lot of the policies that are determined for launch tend to trend much higher on our continuum towards the member experience side at the expense of some of the fraud protections that can be used. And I think this is kind of, you know, exactly what Michael was referring to in his example previously. So we tend to, programs launch, great customer experience, not as much consideration to fraud and security. And then over time, you know, particularly as fraudsters wake up to this program, particularly if it's doing well, if members are actively using it, there's more and more points that are being put into that loyalty ecosystem, it becomes a target. So if and when a fraud event occurs, and it could take many forms, but you know, there's generally some type of attack and the fraudsters are able to escape with some value. When this happens, I would say there's generally a knee-jerk reaction to close the gap, right? There are decisions that are made in a very short space of time to plug the holes. And this usually involves, you know, changing policies or locking down some of the accessibility which made the program so appealing in the first place. So in these scenarios, you know, whereas up front, the member experience was the loudest voice in the room, that's not happening after a fraud event. And I think many of the people on this call have probably been through this process, unfortunately. But when that happens, now executives are looking at the fraud team and kind of some more of the technical team to say, like, guys, we need to plug this hole. We need to stop the bleeding ASAP. And when this happens, you know, we see kind of the bar shift towards the bottom. And a lot of these decisions, though, are going against the member experience side, right? So, and then over time,
Can I chime in, Trevor? Just,
absolutely.
I have an anecdote here where it's very nice that you're talking about these larger breaches, but sometimes it can be very small, because there can be data out there from a series of breaches, and fraudsters will piece together that information to go after a particular individual. So they're going to go after people with high credit scores or high profile. That could be a CEO, an SVP, or some senior executive of the company. So sometimes that breach, that the problem is personal. It's that executive or his wife or her husband or their kids. So it doesn't have to be a massive breach of your company. Sometimes it's the top executives of the company, and that's happening more and more.
Yeah, and we tend to see when that happens, you know, there's a overstated reaction. So even if it's, you know, only a few accounts that were compromised because of who was compromised, you know, there's an overreaction to like plug the gaps, and this needs to be resolved ASAP, which agree with, like we need to plug those gaps, but it's considering as you make those changes, what does that do to the overall member experience? So you may plug that hole in the immediate short term, but again, if we're making the member experience not enjoyable, you end up turning away some members that might be otherwise interacting with the brand. And
this is where they need someone like the likes of yourselves, because you're kind of explaining a pendulum moving between, and that probably moves the pendulum too far in the way of security and how does the voice of reason talk to that executive and say, look, I know you're the personal victim here, but this is not the best thing for the company. So that's where they need the likes of yourselves to bring calm to the storm, I guess.
Yeah, and I think we do generally see that calm of the storm afterwards. So as the program continues to evolve, we recognize, and a lot of times the stats will bear this out, right? Like we're seeing decreased activity because we've locked things down so tight to reduce the fraud. The activity is starting to slow down. So over time, what we generally see is a bit of a loosening of those restrictions that we put in place at the peak of the fraud event, whatever it may be. And we try to loosen these up. So even if we think about just going back to the gift card example, right? So at first we open, there's no restrictions, order as many gift cards as you want, heavy on the member experience side, low on the fraud and security side. A fraud event happens, let's lock things down, let's not allow anybody to do, or make it very difficult for anybody to do a redemption. Like neither of those two can exist long-term. Like we need to find an equilibrium somewhere. And we do usually find that. So there's some tweaking, there's some testing and learning that may need to happen over time, but eventually the kind of guiding light needs to be that we're aiming for that sweet spot, that balance between the two. Okay, let's move to, yeah. Sorry, Chris, do you have another question?
Just saying back to you, sorry.
Oh, okay, perfect. So now I think ultimately, let's take a look at the ideal state of where we're considering both of these components, the member experience side and the fraud and security side, up front. So in this scenario, there are some controls put in place up front, and we can go back to the gift card example as well. Like maybe there's some type of threshold that's there up front. So we're a lot closer to the sweet spot from the very beginning. And using your pendulum example, Chris, we're trying to reduce the amount that pendulum is swinging, so that really there may be some minor tweaks that are required. There's some testing and learning which happens over time, but the overall experience is landing much closer to that sweet spot from the beginning. So if there is a fraud event, hopefully the size of that fraud event is much smaller. There's just some minor tweaking that needs to happen to bring us right back to that kind of steady state line, which is where we want to be from the beginning. So really the objective of this is smoothing out those big jumps and changes from one extreme to the other. And then we can offer the members of the program a much smoother experience overall and stay closer to that ideal. I'm going to move on now to some of the total costs of fraud ownership. And I think, Chris, you touched on it a little bit earlier, that when we think about the different fraud tactics that we're going to employ and how we can find that balance between the member experience and securing against fraud, one of the major considerations needs to be around what I call kind of the total cost of fraud ownership, okay? And there's kind of a pain threshold here. First off, there's going to be some costs of fraud to your program one way or another and we've kind of bucketed in a few different buckets here that we can talk through. As we've already established, like the size of the prize of the value that exists in loyalty programs is too large, and the fraudsters have woken up to that. So we know they're going to come knocking. I don't think there's ever a scenario where we can completely eliminate fraud, or at least eliminate fraud attempts. Our objective here is to limit it as much as possible, but we need to evaluate what that overall cost to the organization is going to be right up front as we're thinking about this program.
And I think Michael might be able to have some comments here as well. Sorry to interrupt, but I think one of the challenges is defining what fraud is. Because so some companies would consider breaking the terms and conditions fraud while others don't. And some people within the same company may consider it fraud or don't. So maybe define what you consider fraud first to be able to find the cost, because we're talking apples and oranges in a lot of companies.
Absolutely, and I think some would only evaluate it if the customer calls in and says, "Hey, this wasn't me." But there's a lot of different ways to evaluate it. So I think identifying what it is goes a long way towards understanding these costs and being able to properly evaluate them. So you've got obviously the costs of when the fraud happens. Whatever the goods and services or the value that's taken out of the program is a hard cost, obviously. And also, I think that the amount of goodwill points to be reimbursed. So let's say a customer calls in and says, "Hey, I've had some fraud on my account." There may be an investigation after, but oftentimes, you're going to reimburse those points on the customer's account to make them whole. So these are all kind of hard costs that you can evaluate. But then as we get into the second and third categories here, I think these are less often considered. So there's so much focus on like the cost of actual fraud or at least identified fraud. The second bucket is really tied to some of the various tools associated with reducing fraud. So I think one that's kind of not an invisible cost, but isn't necessarily associated with fraud directly, is some of the decisions that you may make about ramping up MFA requests. So MFA can be, a very helpful tool in the battle against fraud, but it's not free, right? So like if there's policies where we're going to triple the number of MFA requests, there's going to be a significant impact through the bills from the company that's facilitating those MFA requests, or emails, or text messages that are going out to help customers facilitate that MFA. And Chris, I recall us talking about an example where a company was seeing like almost a restrictive amount of money being spent on MFA, which was helping to lock things down a little bit on their side. But you need to balance that against how much fraud you may be preventing.
So I mean, there is clearly a boom in MFA and in loyalty. Some companies are doing it just to log in. Some are doing it for redemption. But I'm wondering why more companies are not doing it smartly, in a sense. If I'm coming from the same IP address with the same behavior, why are you putting me through MFA or 2FA? But it seems to be that's the blanket reaction of the industry right now, and probably over time the pendulum will swing towards the more less restrictive 2FA. That's my guess, but I don't know if you have any comments there.
I think that's the opportunity, right? To have a much more segmented approach where we're not treating all members the same from a security perspective. To your point, we have same IP address, all of the metrics are green. Why are we asking this member to go through MFA again? There are absolutely scenarios and customers that are not going to be green on all the metrics that we might be evaluating. So I think the big opportunity for savings is really to segment customers and have different security policies for different customers. I think that's the big opportunity.
And I would add, don't forget the call center here, because some do have the 2FA or MFA for the call center, and fraudsters are definitely calling in, right? Like, because sometimes humans are the weak link versus systems. So don't forget the call center.
Absolutely. So like generally with an increase of MFA, you may have a lot more calls into the call center for password resets or a number of different things. So those are costs, like there's a lot of call centers are evaluating, cost per minute or cost per call. Factor in what we think that increase will be when we think about changing policies to go heavier on MFA or heavier restrictions. It's going to drive some call center volume. I think some of the other things.
But also to have 2FA for people that call in, right? Like maybe you have to get a text and repeat the code back to the call center agent, because there definitely is an increased amount of call center fraud currently. And I heard Michael chiming in. So Michael, did you have comments?
I think there's an interesting bit here on that 2FA or MFA. From a program design viewpoint, if you're a program manager, it's not about being a cybersecurity expert, but it's about knowing that the cybersecurity people can see all sorts of patterns, can see all sorts of information with tools that they've got available. And it's having that conversation with them in terms of the design of your program. Here's what we want as the customer experience. How can we balance that? How can we make the door smarter rather than have more locks?
So I would add to you that a lot of those cyber tools also have a customer experience positive angle. In other words, you can identify good customers and upsell them. The same tool can be a positive, an upsell tool versus a fraud tool, right? So talk to your cyber people, because you can increase your sales.
Exactly. So the first part of that is you're wanting to, as I said, not be a cybersecurity expert. There's people that's way above our pay grade, Chris. There are people who have got those skills, but it's if you ask better questions, you'll get better answers. And the cyber people quite often, not always, but cyber people tend to be somewhat similar to fraud managers, as in they're not as outgoing as perhaps program managers might be. But it is understanding that those tools can help you with making a good fraud prevention experience, and as you've rightly pointed out, can also help you upsell, cross-sell, because they can see all sorts of patterns in that data. And as I mentioned to you, Chris, and for the rest of the audience, the British Airways cyber team presented at a session that I was at recently, and I learned a huge amount about the tools that they have available that can address exactly what you've said, that can help cross and upsell too.
Thanks, Michael. Over to you, Trevor. Sorry for all the interruptions, but kind of.
Oh no, this is fantastic. Thanks for chiming in. I think as we think about that third bucket of cost of resources as well, so there may be a team that's evaluating fraud, the call center costs we talked about. Another one of those hidden costs is what I'd consider the executive time, right? So particularly if we design a program that doesn't have a lot of fraud and security controls in place, and a fraud incident happens, a lot of executives get pulled into that, right? And it's drop everything. We need to hop on emergency calls to the late hours of the night. So like there's costs associated with that as well, right? Like the opportunity cost of where their time is used. So just another consideration that I think can help as a selling point of why those fraud and security controls up front make sense and need to be balanced against the member experience. I think overall, these three components do interact together, right? And I think, Michael, you made the point earlier. We might be able to completely lock down and reduce the cost of fraud in the first bucket to almost nothing, but we may be spending so much on the different tools that are involved, and we have an army that's assessing fraud, etc. And at the end of the day, the members aren't going to interact because it's so restrictive. So I think it's finding that balance of how much are we spending on the tools and the resources versus what we expect the fraud to be. And there's some modeling that can be done up front in the design phases. And once the program is running, I think there's modeling as well to say, hey, if we're spending this amount on a new tool that's going to provide scoring for every redemption request, for example, how much is it really going to reduce the fraud? And there's a business case to be made there as well. So all these things are interconnected, and certainly, spending on one may reduce in another. There's a few other questions that I think we would generally ask as we're going through program design. These questions all need to be asked, and there's no fixed answers. I think the answers to some of these questions are going to just depend on, the unique aspects of your program. But what we need to think about are what are some of the redemption options that are available. So, is it travel? Is it gift cards? Is it groceries? What areas are going to have the greatest exposure? So, for example, we work with some co-brand credit card companies that have statement credits. So, maybe that's an area where we don't need to spend as much energy on putting fraud controls in place because the recipient of the value is the holder of the credit card itself. So the fraudsters are not going to be targeting those. They can't benefit from that. So maybe your concern's a little less, but if there's other reward options that are a little bit more liquid, like groceries or gift cards, that's where you want to focus your energies on having tighter controls and think about, something like MFA or a PIN for in-store redemptions. There's a number of different things we can think about there. We also want to think about what customer information is being captured. How are we storing that? And how would fraudsters potentially take pieces of this information to piece together a puzzle to complete an ATO? And Chris, I think you mentioned it earlier, right? Like there may be hacks that just obtain just email addresses or just card numbers, like loyalty card numbers. But those can be then later combined with other elements to create a case where they could get in and do an ATO. I think we just talked about the pain threshold, which was really talking about that total cost of fraud ownership. So like, what's the level of fraud that we can live with? Because I think we need to recognize it's not going to be zero, right? There's going to be attempts. As much as we can lock it down, there's likely going to be some, but what's that manageable level? Is it 1%? Is it 0.5%? So again, not a single answer that's the right answer for everybody, but certainly it needs to be considered up front as we go. Also, we want to think about what behaviors customers are willing to accept, right? So if a customer is already doing an MFA on a regular basis, then maybe that makes sense to implement as part of the checkout process for redemption. Another thought in terms of what customers are comfortable with is tap payments, right? Like everybody's probably tapping their card. You're able to do that up to a certain threshold, but beyond that, there's going to be more security features added. Same kind of concept can be applied to loyalty redemptions as well. So it might be easier at lower values, but for higher value redemptions, there's more security involved. So I think as you work through these questions in the design phase, the answers will really help to frame which of the anti-fraud tactics can be employed for your particular program. Now let's look at some of those tactics as we get into it. So we've answered some of those questions. We've looked at the various program components. We have some answers, we have some thoughts. What are some of the tools that we can use? So I think a lot of these will be very familiar to a lot of people on the line, but we want to think about these upfront in the design phase. But if you're already in a program that's existing, these tactics can certainly be applied after a fraud attack or at any point in time. Some of these can be applied at different levels, and we generally group them together in 4 different buckets. So for our prevention bucket at the top left, we're looking at things like registration and login controls. So this would include MFA and where are we asking the customer to go through an MFA process as well as using third-party tools. As well, this bucket would include things like thresholds. We talked about this for gift cards. So there could be thresholds that are applied to quantity, could be applied to points value, dollar value, or even cumulative value over time. And there's some less common tactics, such as like a user-initiated redemption window, which says, hey, I'm only allowing myself to do a redemption between these, between this 24-hour window, for example. After that, I don't want the ability to do any redemptions. Or it could be, a feature if you have a website or app that you can turn on or off that redemption capability, or even something like a time-bound barcode redemption if you're at more of a point of sale redemption scenario. Second bucket would be detection and monitoring. So here we're looking at velocity rules that could be set up to trigger alerts and investigations, as well as maybe determining when an MFA might be required. Also, it could automatically lock down an account based on some unusual activity. From our alerts and reporting bucket, so this bucket is really looking at how we notify customers that an activity has occurred. And I think this relates to, Chris, your earlier point about how do we actually identify fraud. And I'm sure most of the people on the line here have received an email stating, hey, it could be from your Amazon account or something, right? Like, we see a login was detected, maybe from a different device. Was this really you? If it was you, no action required. If it wasn't you, please reach out to let us know and we can lock it down. So those are some of the concepts that we can apply to profile changes or redemption requests, where that immediate communication is triggered to the member and gives them an opportunity to respond. So, and this comes back to the example of gift cards. Like if we have a window where the customer can respond and say, hey, this wasn't me, maybe we have the opportunity to cancel that redemption request. But again, as the more notifications that we send out, we need to consider the incremental costs, right? So there's costs of those notifications going out. There's call center costs that are going to be associated with that. That might be fine, and in your modeling that makes sense, but it just needs to be considered up front when you're taking these decisions. And the last bucket that we have is cybersecurity. So not necessarily specific to loyalty programs here, but this applies to any business. So looking at things like penetration tests, security monitoring on your front door, as well as regular security reviews and upgrades. As we know, this is an ever-evolving area. Fraudsters are getting more sophisticated, so really programs and program operators can't afford to be complacent, or else the fraudsters are smart enough that they're going to figure out a way through. So really this kind of
Trevor,
yeah, sorry.
I was just going to say you make an interesting point there about the fraudsters being sophisticated, and on your alerts and reporting, what we're seeing or what we're hearing from programs now is that the fraudsters once they've taken over the account, are also signing people up for, they're using a bot to sign people up to, hundreds of newsletters, which then flood their inbox with emails, which then buries the notification messaging. And it's one of those bits where I said, you can put more locks on if you're doing that, but just be aware that the fraudsters know what we're doing and will try and figure a way to get around it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think overall, all of these tactics can be considered. We're not, advocating that any one of these tactics makes sense for your program. I think they need to be looked at on a holistic fashion. Think about, the redemption options that you have. Where are the exposure points in the program? And then think about how some of these tactics can be applied to find the right mix for your program, while both considering that member experience as well as the protecting against the fraud vulnerabilities. So I think we're wrapping up some of the content here. So just wanted to recap a few of the main takeaways from the discussion. Firstly, I think there's no silver bullet that I or anyone else can impart that's going to reduce fraud attempts from your program overall. I think fraud attempts are a part of the loyalty landscape today, but what we can do is right up front from the very beginning, consider ways of how we're going to deal with these fraud attempts and hopefully reduce the success rate that they're having. And think about how you can apply some of those tactics to your unique program and balance them against the member experience. I just want to reiterate, one size doesn't fit all here. For some programs, having a heavy dose of MFA or two-factor authentication may absolutely be the right solution. Well, as for another program, it doesn't fit with the member experience that we're trying to achieve, and we just need to look at some other tactics. So really, this is unique to each program. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution here necessarily. And lastly, it's really an evolution. So, as Michael was just referring to, the fraudsters are getting more and more sophisticated with their attacks. So the solutions that were in place, a year ago or even 6 months ago need to be refreshed and reconsidered. So it's a continual process. We need to continually evaluate, test the policies that fit the needs of your unique program, and build in a constant review process. Like put it in calendars that, quarterly, monthly, biannually, whatever, we're taking a look at those policies and identifying, has anything changed? What needs to be tweaked? And I think there is definitely a continual test and learn and some updates and reviews that need to be done on an overall basis. And then when all these considerations are in place, we hope that we can keep those fraud attempts as unsuccessful as possible, and we end up with a secure program that customers trust and feel comfortable with. And that's really the end goal here. Okay, so I think that's it for the content phase. If you have any questions about program design and how to consider fraud vulnerability as part of the setup of your program, please feel free to reach out to me directly. My contact info is here. You can reach me by email or through LinkedIn, or please feel free to reach out to any of my colleagues at Bond at info@bondbl.com. I'll be happy to have a conversation to discuss how we can apply some of these components into your program.
So we have 5 minutes left. I can take an audience question if you'd like, Trevor, and I would encourage
Sure.
Michael, give some thought of what you would like people to remember from today, and I'll call on you, Michael. So first audience question is just more housekeeping. So people wanted the recording, so yes, we will share the recording. Second question was, can you share more on best practices for bringing in fraud, cyber risk into the design phase of a program? Like how can a company go about doing that better?
I think if it's trying to convince the executives that these fraud and consideration components need to be involved, I think sharing some of the stats, like to look at Chris, I know you're seeing increase in reports of fraud, the $1 billion that's being lost to loyalty programs. I think this should be having the ears perk up of any executive in terms of why this is an important component up front. And I think some of those findings from the loyalty report as well, right? Like, so seeing the increase in customer satisfaction when they know that their information is secure and protected, hugely backs up the need to say, we can't only be thinking about the member experience here. We have to find that balance between the two so that customers feel secure to interact. So I think, sharing some of that information should be perking up the ears of those executives.
So Chris.
Go ahead, Michael.
Oh, so I was going to, this is partly a question. Before I do the follow-on part, the question will be to you, Trevor. Are there any programs, either ones that you're involved with, that you think have got some good practice that you can share? And the other bit is to give one example. I'm not going to mention which the company is, but their fraud team organizationally moved into becoming part of the cyber team, and they have a very comprehensive dashboard that monitors things like, for example, ghost accounts, and that one-page dashboard has got lots of metrics on it with hard numbers. And that is, giving them additional resources internally, and it's very easy for the executives, both of the program and of the company that owns this business, to be able to see the issue in hard facts and numbers. So there are some people doing it. I'm not going to name who the program is, but Trevor, I don't know if you can.
That's called cyber
well,
fraud.
Yes.
And it's definitely a trend. We will see more of it. So
yeah, and I think I won't call any names of programs, but certainly what we're seeing is that the programs we're working with are getting more sophisticated in terms of tracking. So we're seeing some of those dashboards as well that are that are at an executive level. So evaluating what's coming in, on a daily and weekly basis to say, how's fraud trending this week? How are reported instances of this being reported? And I think what we're also seeing is trending of having more of those communication channels with members. So how can we improve the notification to them, enable them, and enable contact center to respond when they're seeing reports of the fraud? So that's where a lot of the focus has been that we're seeing today.
So Michael, I'm going to ask you in a minute. I'll let Michael and I will both give our final takeaways. And what I really was most struck by what you said today, Trevor, was about the pendulum and about designing the program from the beginning, so you're not swinging wildly from customer experience to fraud and risk and have this pendulum bouncing back and forth. But I don't think people can do it without the likes of yourself and Bond Brand Loyalty or experts, because like if I'm just you've designed dozens, right? Like, so you've seen this before. Like if I'm just going in this blind, I'm not going to know how to do that. So that's that's my takeaway, that you need an expert like yourself in the design phase to help, so that you're not swinging wildly between marketing and risk. So
absolutely, just have those conversations up front, have those considerations in the design phase, and it reduces a lot of the pain later on, for sure.
And Michael, your takeaway? Are you there, Michael?
Yes, I think broadly similar to yourself, Chris. I think it is getting that sweet spot. When I think back to my days at British Airways, it's not a sexy or exciting subject, to talk about fraud, it's a pain whenever it's the chief executive's partner that's been defrauded, and then everybody's running around like headless chickens. I'd far rather start now trying to get to that sweet spot, knowing that this is going to happen, and how can I make sure that all the hard work that people are doing to earn all the points are protected, but in a good way.
Well, thank you for that. And I would just a final wrap up. Everyone can link with Trevor on LinkedIn. Go to Bond Brand Loyalty's website and check out. They've got great resources, including that report with Visa. And we have a couple of upcoming events here that you can use those QR codes to check out some future events where LSA will be participating. With that, thanks to Trevor, thanks to Michael, Bond Band Loyalty in the audience, and we are closing off. We've hit the end of the hour, so thanks to everyone. Signing off. Thanks, Trevor.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.